All right, let's take a breath because this is going to be very confusing. All right, so any attempt to unveil absolute objective truth will lead towards a paradox. Every statement that refers to the true nature of reality itself will by definition contradict itself. Now, why is this the case? Well, first ask yourself the question: what is the nature of a truth statement? What is the nature of an objective statement? Notice that the statement itself, the objective claim, is itself a part of reality. It must be a part of reality because it's impossible for it to manifest itself outside of reality. Otherwise, it wouldn't exist. So, the objective statement itself is an existing thing within reality, and it is trying to describe something about the whole of reality. For example, all trees are made of wood. Now notice that the objective statement, all trees are made of wood, is referring to something that exists outside of itself and which is different from itself. So we are talking explicitly about two distinct things here. One is a statement by itself, and the other is a tree by itself. And it is the statement that is referring to the tree, and it is the statement that is also conceptualizing it as a tree. The tree itself doesn't identify itself as a tree. The tree has no self-knowledge whatsoever. You see, the problem with statements and with language in general is that it always represents something outside of itself. It refers to something which is not itself. And this leads us inevitably towards paradoxes, because everything is essentially itself, and nothing can go outside of itself. If something could escape itself, it would stop being itself and it would die. For example, a word is a word, and a word is not an airplane or a planet. But airplane and planet are both words, and they are not literally an airplane or a planet. You see, the word planet is itself not literally a planet, it's a word, and it refers to something outside of itself being a word. But what is a word? Does the word word refer to itself? Can it possibly refer to itself? Well, this is the point where it gets tricky, because in order for the word word to refer to itself, it would have to go outside of itself in order to perceive itself as being the word word. It first has to perceive itself so that it can refer to itself. But the problem is that when the word itself goes outside of itself, it stops being itself. Then it is no longer the word itself. But it needs to go outside of itself to perceive itself so that it can refer to itself. But that's impossible. So it is absolutely impossible for the word itself to refer to itself as being the word. And this is what is called the self-referential paradox. A thing that is itself cannot refer to itself because it would have to escape the beingness of itself. And nothing can escape its own being in order to perceive its own being. So nothing can essentially refer to itself as being itself. But it can use itself to represent something else. Let me repeat this, because this is one of the most important statements that you must acknowledge within your life. Nothing can essentially refer to itself as being itself, but it can use itself to represent something else. And that's what we have been doing since forever. Everything what is considered to be information, knowledge, ideas, statements, conceptualizations is all stuff that represents everything except its own true nature, its own being. That's the fundamental problem with language, with communication, with knowledge. Knowledge represents everything except being, which is the most crucial aspect of everything in existence. For example, look at your hand. From the moment you identify that thing as your hand, a couple of thoughts are representing themselves as the statement my hand. But notice that in reality, those thoughts are literally just being themselves without representing anything. In reality, nothing refers to anything else. Everything is just itself, without reference, without representation, because again it's impossible to escape the beingness of itself. So those thoughts which represent your hand are required to refer to your hand, because the hand itself cannot refer to itself. It needs something else to refer to it. Now let's go a little deeper. Those thoughts which represent your hand are themselves represented by other thoughts, and those thoughts are again themselves represented by other thoughts ad infinitum. From the moment you want to refer to something, you need something else to represent it. You can't use the same thing to represent itself. And that's why everything contradicts itself. Or at least we are contradicting ourselves all the time by trying to represent everything as it is in its own nature, but not realizing that we are using something else to represent the very thing in and of itself that we are trying to represent. So once again, look at your hand. The thoughts that represent the statement, "This is my hand," are themselves just thoughts, which in reality don't represent anything but themselves as the true nature of what they are. And whatever that is absolutely paradoxical. But at the same time, they refer to the statement, "This is my hand." They refer to something outside of themselves being thoughts. Like they are trying to point to something real and objective outside of themselves, but neglecting that they themselves are at the same level of realness, and the level of realness does not differ from the level of realness outside of themselves. It's the exact same realness. So instead of focusing on something outside of themselves, which is paradoxical anyways, they should focus on themselves, but without referring to themselves. There is no need to prove that something exists outside of yourself, because the very thing that you're using to prove it is itself already the proof that there is no difference between you and whatever you consider to be outside of yourself. So essentially, everything in reality is itself, in the sense that it is just being itself without representing anything else. But at the same time, nothing can refer to itself due to the self-referential paradox. And the reality that we know of is the reality in which everything represents everything else except itself. And ironically, our goal is to represent the things in and of themselves, their true nature, but the true nature of everything is that everything is itself without representing anything else. So it is absolutely paradoxical to try to represent it, because it doesn't represent anything but itself. Even the statement, "it represents itself," is paradoxical, because of the self-referential paradox once again. So the true nature of reality is absolutely paradoxical. And the knowledge that we have about reality is based on the fact that the true nature of reality represents itself as everything but itself. Now, I have no idea whether or not this made any sense to you, but it's just so damn hard to explain the paradoxical nature of reality. But anyway, thanks for listening.